Okay, so here we are. Let's present this Amazon Cognito use case. What we are after in this session is to log in into the AWS console as the one that you are seeing behind me, the console itself. So as you see here, I'm logged in with a regular IAM user, and the point is to log in using an AWS Amazon Cognito user. So let's see. Let's go over the solution. As you can see, we've got user pools and identity pools in Cognito. Remember, user pools are kind of the identity federated or identity federation service from AWS. And the federated identities or AWS identity pools or Cognito identity pools is the AWS STS credentials exchange engine, or I don't know if it's officially called anything like that, but basically once you have got an JSON Web Token from user pool, from AWS Cognito user pool, we're going to exchange it for STS credentials in the identity pool. So let's have a look first at the Cognito user pool. And here, and this is basically a standard out-of-the-box Cognito user pool setup. The only difference is that I have declared a custom attribute called groups, and I'm gonna have it mapped to the SAML external Azure AD federation. So I have another identity federation engine. In this case, is our source is Azure AD Federation. This is a testing Azure AD in which I have my testing user, and I have federated to Cognito user pool using this identity provider field. Although the whole thing is done using infrastructure as code in Terraform, and in the description of the video you're going to find a link to the repository. And important thing, as I say here, is that I'm mapping some standard attributes from Azure AD into Cognito. But basically the most important one is the groups. I'm going to use these groups Azure AD claims in Cognito user pool in order to be mapped to the JSON Web Token that Cognito user pool is going to generate for me. With this group, I'm gonna do a further map in federated identities in Cognito identity pool, and I'm gonna use this. So let me edit the identity pool. You can see it. I'm gonna use that field, that JSON Web Token field, in order to map it to specific roles that I have configured here in this AWS account. So long story short, if my Azure AD user is in this group ID or in this group ID in Azure AD, those group IDs, they are going to end up being mapped in the groups claim of the JSON Web Token that that user pool it's going to generate for me, and hence I'm mapping them in identity pool into AWS roles, standard AWS roles with permissions, with standard permissions. These roles are the roles that we are going to use to we are going to assume rather than use from Cognito, and once we've got these roles, we are going to use them for login into the console. So we will be not anymore logged in as a user, but will be logged in as a role, will be an assumed role. So how does this work? Let's go back to the user pool and check one thing that is called hosted UI. So in the client application integration, we've got here in Cognito user pool, we've got here Azure AD as enable identity provider, which is the identity provider that we have federated with SAML, remember? And we've got this callback URL. This is important because this callback URL is the URL that Cognito hosted UI is going to send me, or it's going to redirect my request once I have successfully authenticated. So if we have a look at this hosted UI, oh sorry, this is the information link. Here it is, launch hosted UI. If we have a look here, we've got the Cognito built-in login, and we've got the Azure AD login button. If we click in there, we are going to be prompted to sign in using Azure AD. And let me grab my testing user here. This is my testing user. I'm not going to log in yet. I'm going to explain a little bit before what is going to happen. Once I log in with this user from Azure AD, Cognito is going to give me back a code grant. Okay, it's a little code from Cognito, which means, okay, you've been successfully authenticated. So now you're having this code, and with this code you can retrieve a JSON Web Token ID. It's going to redirect me to the callback URL with that code in the URL as an argument. So what I have to do is to provide something in this callback URL that it's going to grab that code, and it's going to transform it into a JSON Web Token code or a JSON Web Token. And with that JSON Web Token, that very same functionality, it's going to be able to create a federated IP sign-in URL call. So where it's here in this callback URL, well, it's another AWS service. It's an API gateway, and let's have a look at this one. It's a very simple HTTP basic gateway, gateway API, basic API. It's got no roots, no anything. It's just got one backend, which is a Lambda function. And this Lambda function is the one that's going to do the whole functionality that we're going to see. So let me show you first what happens when I log in. Okay, so we're still in Azure AD territory, and this is going to go back to the callback URL. And now all the magic has happened already, and I'm logged into the console, but now I'm not a user anymore. I'm assumed role. I'm using the credentials, STS credentials from a federated login assumed role. Okay, this one called Cognito identity credentials student role, whatever. And from now on we can just operate in the console normally. So now let's have a brief look at what's actually going on in the Lambda function that I just showed you. Let's switch into my code here. We've got a little bit of Terraform. This code, it's all included in the description of the video. You're going to find a repository with the whole code. There is a little bit of Terraform as the infrastructure as code tool, and this Terraform is going to provide the API gateway, the Lambdas, the Cognito user pool and identity pools, all that for you. And the important bit that I want to have a look now, which is the Lambda itself. I'm not going to go through this code. I'm just going to fastly explain you what it does. This is written in Golang, by the way, which is my favorite language. Basically what it does is to retrieve, we can probably see it here in console redirect. It's going to retrieve the code grant that we spoke about. And with this code grant, we're gonna call the Cognito API URL, okay? And we're gonna exchange the code grant for a JSON Web Token. And the JSON Web Token, it's gonna have an ID token. This ID token, we're gonna further exchange for this time into the identity pool. We're gonna further exchange the ID token for an STS token. So this is a Cognito functionality. you can exchange JSON Web Tokens for STS regular AWS credentials. At this point, we're going to have STS credentials, which are in the typical format that you may know already, which is access key, secret key, and session token. And we are going to do a further token exchange. We're going to exchange those STS credentials for a so-called sign-in token. And the sign-in token, it's going to be, let me see, I have that here we go, sign-in token, that code in another tab. That sign-in token, it's been created by another different API. It's called the Federation API in AWS. And this Federation API, we're going to use it in two steps. The first one is asking for that sign-in token. So we're going to basically exchange the STS token for the sign-in token. And once we've got it, we're going to create another URL call, but we're not going to call it. We are just going to construct the URL, which is going to be a URL containing the same Federation API and the sign-in token and a couple of get parameters, as in action is going to be login, destination is going to be the console, and the sign-in token itself. Once we've got this, we're going to give it back as an output of our Lambda function, and we're going to make the API, the gateway API, to redirect the Firefox or Chrome or whatever, Safari, whatever browser do you use. We're going to redirect it to this sign-in token Federation URL with the sign-in token. Once that happens, the Federation URL itself, the Federation API, it's going to do a further step, a last step, which is another redirection. And that last redirection is whatever you saw. It's going to redirect us directly into the console, and we're gonna be already logged into the console without any further user or password prompt, and we're gonna have those whichever permissions this role have. We're gonna be able to use the console normally. So that's it for the session. We're gonna leave it here, and if you have any questions now, feel free to ask them. Okay, so we've got a question here about the stuff that I mentioned briefly before. What happens? Where is that group mapping stuff, and is there any other way to do that? And yes, so there are a couple of ways of authorizing groups in Cognito. You always have to do a mix of Cognito user pool and federated identities, or Cognito identity pool. The way that I've done it here, it's kind of just mapping a group that it's coming from a zero ID. I'm mapping it to a claim that it's going to be present into the JSON Web Token that Cognito user pool is generating. And then I'm doing a simple, you do not have permissions to access the. Okay, I'm back here with permissions, hopefully. And I was going to show you the naive way, the simple way that I've done well, it's not necessarily naive, but it's certainly not complicated. The way that I've done it is, as I say, just mapping a string or a field, a claim to speak in JSON Web Token naming. A claim that is going to be present in the JSON Web Token, which is called groups. And I'm just checking that there is a string present in that claim. Simple as that. But there is another way, which is probably more familiar with some of you. And so thank you, Ruben, for asking. And that way it's down here in user pools. You have these users and groups, built-in groups. These are Cognito groups. And you can create a group here called whatever, test group. and you can already point it to a role. Okay, these are IAM roles that they exist. So let's say we use this Cognito admin role and create the group. This role, test role, it's already mapped in Cognito to a role. What does it mean? Here's the role IRN. What it means is that if you go back to identity pools, we could be configuring it in a, go back to dashboard and edit identity pool. We could configure it in a slightly simpler way, which stands for going to our authentication provider. Rather than putting rules, like let's call them handmade rules, as I have done here, as in a certain claim contains or equals or start with or whatever this string. These are like manual, certainly maybe complicated rules. Rather than doing that, you could click in here and directly choose the rule from token, and that's all that you have to configure. Maybe you can also configure whether if the user doesn't match any of the, if the user doesn't belong to any group that it's already attached to a role, we have two things to be done. We can use a default IAM role, or we can just deny, as in do not go back any STS credentials. Okay, but this is the same case for whether we are doing it with the so-called rules or whether we are doing it with the choose the role from token configuration. So I hope that answers your question about the two ways of attaching or checking a role into a user. Okay, doc, thanks a lot.